Welcome to the Retro Graveyard, the show where each week we take a different piece of old, discontinued video game hardware back from the grave to give it a retrospective, and this week we're talking about the Sega Genesis. The Nintendo Famicom dominated the home video game market in Japan throughout the 1980s since its 1983 launch. No competitors managed to put a dent into Nintendo's empire until 1988, when Sega launched the Mega Drive and started an all-out assault on Nintendo. The Sega Genesis was released in North America in August of '89. It's known as the Mega Drive pretty much everywhere else, for reasons that are not officially known, although it's speculated it was because of a trademark dispute. The Sega Genesis was the first fully 16-bit home video game console. It was actually adapted from Sega's System 16 arcade game board, which ran titles like Shinobi, Golden Axe, and that other one, Altered Beast, that's what it is. The Genesis actually originally came bundled with a copy of Altered Beast, which was ported from the aforementioned System 16. Because of the similar hardware, it actually ended up looking pretty close to its original. But regardless of how faithfully they could port these arcade games to Genesis, that doesn't mean that these games were well suited for home console use. Gamers complained of the short repetitiveness of these arcade ports, which prompted Sega to come up with Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic was then bundled with the Genesis, and soon caught on as Sega's mascot, an answer to Nintendo's Mario. The Sega Genesis is also backwards compatible with Sega's previous console, the Sega Master System. One of the first peripherals released for the Sega Genesis was called the Power-Based Converter, which enabled this. There were lots of other accessories that were released for the Sega Genesis, but I think they're all kind of deserving of their own video, so I'm not going to get too into them. The Genesis controller looks a bit weird, but it actually fits surprisingly well in the hand. It originally had these three face buttons, A, B, and C, but later on, Sega released this 6-button controller, which had these 3 extra buttons on top, which became pretty essential for fighting games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, and some to this day still consider this to be the best controller ever produced, ever. For its first couple years of existence, the Genesis really blew the nest out of the water in terms of graphical capabilities, but in '91, Nintendo introduced the Super Nintendo, which kinda evened things out. Later on in the Super Nintendo's life cycle, Nintendo came up with something that they called the Super Effects chip, which actually enabled sprite scaling and simple 3D effects in games like Yoshi's Island and Star Fox. Sega had an answer to this as well. Theirs was called the Virtua Processor, but the only game that included one was called Virtua Racing. Virtua Racing actually ran a lot smoother than any of the comparable 3D Super Nintendo games, but at $100, it was the most expensive Sega Genesis cartridge in existence. There were many versions of the Sega Genesis created. In fact, more than a dozen variations of the Genesis or Mega Drive have been released by Sega. In addition to the licensed versions like this or the Nomad that Sega made, there are also some third-party licensed ones like the Genesis 3 and stuff like that. So anyway guys, that's about it for the Sega Genesis. If you had one of these things, be sure to let me know what you thought of it in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to thumbs it up, subscribe for more Retro Graveyard, all that stuff. Also, if you want a Dreamcast Dream Eye like the one featured in 2 videos ago, I am giving that exact one away in a contest. There's a few ways to enter. If you haven't done it already, you might as well. You get a free crappy camera out of it if you want it. Alright guys, thanks for watching. See you next week.